It's wonderful to be with everybody today from around this country, from around the world. Tricycle Mahasangha. I'd like to begin with a moment of silence in honor of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and all victims of racial violence. In this tumultuous time we live in, systemic injustice, opposition, oppression, and brutality. This time of standing up, challenging greed, hatred, and delusion. It's important that we realize that part of delusion is the idea that we are somehow isolated and disconnected from each other, separable and walled off. Usually we think about practice as an interior event that then gets applied in the outer world. But those are dualistic formations. As we change the world, we're changing ourselves. And as we cultivate ourselves, we change the world. Oppressive systems don't just oppress outside, they become internalized. And we need to free ourselves from their shackles. Let's examine for just a moment the simple act of breathing. Millions are marching in the streets all over the world to protest racial violence and to affirm the sanctity of all life and the fact that Black lives matter. And as people march and stand with each other, they're getting tear gassed, pepper sprayed, held in chokeholds. And the slogan itself, "I can't breathe," is on signs and throughout our culture. So I wonder if we can reclaim our breath, our inspiring action, our inspiration. I've come to see that in this day and age, breathing in, breathing out freely is actually an act of resistance. It's a declaration of liberation. It's also an act of resilience, something that we need to cultivate. The breath connects inner and outer, mind and body. We can use our breath to transform suffering and generate compassion, as we'll explore in our meditation shortly. One of the most painful parts of recent events was hearing George Floyd, as he was dying, say, "Mama, I can't breathe." And his mama was already dead, but he was still calling out for safety, calling out for compassion. In the Tibetan tradition, it's often said that each of us is or has been at some point in our lives or our past lives one another's mama. And what would the world be like if we actually realized this kind of powerful, intrinsic connection with all beings? We're so interwoven with other beings, and the denial of that causes such suffering. So as we stand together, we sit together. And as we sit together, we're standing together, reclaiming the rhythms of our body, our individual, collective, particular, universal body. It's important that we learn how to foster peace and well-being, equanimity, even in the midst of the fire. You know, it's an old Buddhist phrase, the lotus grows in the midst of the fire. And we certainly are in fiery times. The lotus actually also grows out of garbage, but only if we're able to transform that garbage into rich compost that we can offer the world. We are being lived by the events in the world as much as, if not more than, we are living them. And we're sitting with it all, too much to process. And yet we sit with it all, listening, open to inspiration, open to wise, compassionate action. Acting as the agent of compassion that we are. Acting as the bodhisattva that we all are. In some conventional wisdom, the bodhisattva sits on the sidelines until all beings are awakened, postponing her awakening or her full awakening. She's already the bodhisattva awakened. But that's never really rang true for me, the idea that we somehow can't be free until all are free. And so the implication is that there may be some sort of lag time. But today there's no lag time, and we can't afford lag time. And it seems to me that the bodhisattva who is one, who realizes deeply in his bones that his liberation is bound up with the liberation of all others. And that when others suffer, he suffers. And when others rejoice and celebrate, he rejoices and separates. Not for them, apart from them, but as them. And likewise, as we cultivate the deepest parts of our nature and bring them forth to nourish the world, all beings benefit. This is a function of just how interconnected we actually are. An Aboriginal elder once said, "If you're coming here to liberate me, it's better you turn around and go home. But if you're coming here and you understand that your liberation is bound up with mine, then please come and we'll work together." Now I'm going to share with you an adaptation of an ancient meditation practice of compassion. We can experience it together. I'll ring the bell 3 times, and then to close, I'll ring the bell once. Find a comfortable position and let yourself feel the weight of your body on your chair or your cushion or on the floor. That spot at which your bottom connects with the earth, knowing that the earth is supporting you, as is the presence of hundreds from around the world in this very moment. Let yourself relax. Notice any discomfort or tension. Just let it go through your out-breath as you sink in and settle into your Buddha seat. Let your belly be soft like a baby's belly, so the diaphragm can rise and fall as it will. And just become aware of your breathing. There's no particular quality to achieve. Just notice the in-breath and the out-breath. Or perhaps you notice it around your nostrils and your upper lip. Just breathing freely. And notice that as you're breathing, it happens by itself. without your will. You don't have to decide that now I'm going to inhale. Now I'm going to exhale. When you exhale slowly, letting all the air out of your lungs, the inhale comes when it will. So notice that it's as if you're being breathed. Breathed by life. Nourished in a vast, living, interconnected web. The forests are providing oxygen for us. We are breathing in their exhales. And as we exhale, we're providing them the materials that they can transform. This benevolent exchange is our breathing, our great body breathing. Now I invite you to imagine your breath as a stream of air, a current of air. And you take in that current of air through your nose, down your windpipe, into your lungs, and right into your heart. Picture the air flowing right through this loop into your heart and right into the world. The breath stream flowing freely. Now I invite you to open your awareness to the anguish in the world today. Just much as you can, open to that suffering. Open to an image or images of real pain. These images are present to you in function of the fact that we are so interdependent. We can welcome in the pain of the world. So much as you can, relax and just let these images surface. Now I invite you to breathe in this pain like little granules on the ribbon of air. Breathing it in through our nose, down the windpipe and the lungs, and into our heart. Feeling the impact, but not grasping or pushing it away. As you breathe it through and into your heart, you breathe it out your heart into the world, breathing out peace, well-being, and compassion. Breathing in the pain as little granules on the top of your breath stream, through your lungs, into your heart, where you can let yourself feel them and then let themselves flow through and exit your heart as compassion and caring and healing and peace. You are letting yourself transform the pain of the world and find a way to exhale nourishment and well-being back in. If the image or images that emerged were not about the pain of other beings, perhaps it was about your own suffering. In that case, proceed in the same way. Just let yourself visualize that suffering as granules on a ribbon of air, that your breath stream that you breathe in right into your heart, and you allow it to transform as you breathe out well-being, peace, wellness. The lotus grows in the fire, the anguish of the world. And the lotus literally grows through the transformation of suffering. Perhaps discarded remnants of our own experience of self or of world that are reclaimed as our very own birthright, as an act of resistance, as an act of resilience, as an act of transformative healing. Know that you are not an isolated, walled off, separable entity all by your lonesome. But you are a resilient pattern and patterning, softly assembled, responsive to causes and conditions, able to sit with and through suffering of the world and our own suffering, which is also of the world, and how to transform it. So I invite us to practice like this for a few more minutes. If there's not an image that comes to mind or a felt sense, that's okay too. It's difficult sometimes to actually feel. And just let yourself breathe that in and exude compassion. We're creating supple hearts, open minds, the ingredients of an agent of compassion.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for sharing that practice with us. And as we transition out of the practice, we have some time for Q&A now. So if you have a question, you can navigate to the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom panel, or post a comment if you are on Facebook Live. So Charles Lee has submitted a question. The feeling of exhaustion has arisen in many of my most recent meditation practices. Any suggestions on how to practice with exhaustion?
The first thing is to not only recognize exhaustion, which you have, but also understand that exhaustion is a most human response to current situations. And I think as we're able to find that context for it, then it's not as if we love it, but we welcome it. We lean into even the exhaustion. And we generate a sense of kindness toward ourselves for the many tasks that we've done that maybe have left us exhausted. And in that welcoming, in that kindness, we can become pacified, we can become peaceful. And in that sense of peace and connection, energy will start to kindle. Now, there are other techniques we can do, like Kundalini breathing, but I'm not that familiar with them. The other thing I might suggest is to go outside, find a garden, observe something in that garden, maybe a hummingbird or a butterfly. Feel the life in that garden. Feel your connection with that life. And begin to practice mindful breathing as an exchange with that life-giving force that you may feel depleted from now, but which you can share, take in, and exchange with the world.
Thank you. So there are a few questions about anger. Hoda and Larry both are writing about anger. So Hoda says, anger is strong, how to practice without anger. And Larry asks, what is the role of anger in our response to recent events?
Well, maybe I'll make them a twofer and try to get to each of them. And if I don't, Eliza, remind me. The first thing is I would not set as a goal practicing without anger, particularly if I was feeling angry. I think that's a recipe for a dualistic tussle, which is very familiar to spiritual practitioners. You know, we are feeling one way and we're trying to eliminate it so we can purify ourselves and practice the correct way. Everything I said about exhaustion would apply to anger. It's very important for us to see that there's a certain kind of anger, a righteous kind of anger, that is completely plausible. I hesitate to say normal, but human in face of our current world. So I think it's important to welcome that anger and understand that it's just such a human response. The challenge is when anger is gnawing at us and we're fueling it in some kind of way, either by feeling helpless to get out of its grips or by trying to fix it. You know, it's not so much what we're feeling that's a problem, but how we respond to what we're feeling. And if we get caught up in anger, that's to say, enmeshed and attached, then we start to, that just fuels that anger, and it can turn into not such a righteous anger, it can turn into a hateful kind of anger. And we can be burning with that. And we can burn ourselves to the ground. But a skillful use of anger doesn't have to do that. Again, we can have compassion for ourselves, that we have a sense of justice and connection, and we feel with the world. But as we feel the energy of anger, we allow it to come through us, and we allow it to pass through. All feelings have a beginning, a middle, and an end, if we let them have a beginning, middle, and end. If we don't do battle with them, or we don't deny them and push them away. So the second question, what is the role of anger? I think it's an energizing force, isn't it? Sure it is. I'm sure my teacher, Robert Aitken, in fact, I can remember him saying, if you're feeling angry, do angry zazen. How many of us sat through a day or more during a session feeling consumed with anger? It was very difficult to get through it. We were stuck on it, and it was stuck in us. So practicing skillfully with it, it eventually will pass. But as a psychic fuel, if you will, as a motivational fuel, it moves us to action. It allows us to feel potent, a sense of agency, a sense of meaning and importance, allows us to feel kind of big. Now that can be a problem, to feel big-headed, but in small doses, it gets us off our duff, gets us moving. And it could be an antidote to helplessness and lethargy, and maybe even to exhaustion. Who knows?
Thank you. I think you answered both those questions. And Christine has another question related to anger. I thought it would be a good point to put it in. She asks, what about anger towards leaders and powers that be? How to transform?
Well, sometimes a story is worth more than 1,000 words. Unfortunately, my stories are sometimes 1,000 words, but I'll try to make the story short. I was working with a group of veterans, all of whom were suffering from not only classical physiologically based post-traumatic stress, but the kind of moral injuries that come from war and participating in trauma. Just remind me of the question so I stay on track.
Christine,
Eliza, yeah, just what was the question again?
The question was so what about anger towards leaders? And
towards leaders, right. There was one particular vet who had been blown up in an IED blast, and he lost 3 of his buddies and most of his brain and his right eye, and it was reconstructed with composite material, and he wore a patch over his eye. He was a rather dashing looking young man. This happened on his 21st birthday. His name was Rory. And he came to our first Coming Home Project retreat back in 2008, I believe it was. And he was packing. He was packing anger. And he was packing anger at W. Those of you who are old enough to remember W, George W. Bush. There's not enough anger to go around to vis-a-vis George W. Bush, who in a way was a war criminal. And Rory understood that we never should have been in that war, and he never should have been in that particular battle, and he never should have had to lose his buddies. And primarily his concern was for his buddies, but it was also for the angry loop that he was caught up in, that he couldn't stop. He couldn't stop talking about the leaders and how much he hated them, and the things he wished would happen to them. And as the facilitator, I thought to myself, who am I to change his mind? What better place for him to let it all out? And yet at the same time, it was blocking him. He was caught up in it and he couldn't see beyond it. And having a traumatic brain injury made it extra difficult because he was kind of perseverating. He couldn't get out of that brain loop. It wasn't just as if he blew off some steam and then he was fine. It just fed on itself. The next retreat, there was a single Marine Corps officer who shadowed Rory for the entire retreat, 5 days. Not just meditation, but lots of small groups and social and recreational activities. And he conveyed to Rory, although he was very high in the command, that everything Rory was feeling was justified. He had the right to feel all of it. And knowing that he had the right to feel all of it, and having this figure with him, having this sense of connection and community, I don't think I've ever seen a transformation like I saw in Rory. He became able to listen to other people and to realize that his anguish was not the only anguish in the room. And he began to become really curious and solicitous of them and compassionate. And it was just remarkable. It was as if community trumped brain chemistry. So what's the lesson from this? I really leave it to you to deduce. You may have a different one than I did, but solidarity and the sense of community is extraordinarily powerful. That's why when all of us sit together from across the world, there's more power in that. And we have the possibility then of watching that stuckness be transformed. I think getting stuck on anger at a particular leader blinds us to the deeper, the wider issues and the opportunities for transformation. Now, that doesn't mean I don't want to get rid of them, but it just means I don't have to get stuck on them.
Thank you. Shall we have another question?
Oh, please, I'm game, as
Okay.
many as we have time for.
Excellent. So Colette says, I have a sister that does not acknowledge the horror of the recent events. It has divided the family. It is really strange, and it's not like her. Any suggestions?
Just love her. Don't judge her. Process your own confusion. Process your own disappointment, sorrow even, that you can't connect with her about this. But if I've learned it once, I've learned it 1,000 times. That the only one we can change is us. And that when we change ourselves, as we change ourselves, we become agents of compassion for the world. But if we're trying, and if there's a hidden kind of judgment about, particularly with a loved one, and an expectation, then I think that will be quite corrosive. I remember being at Plum Village in the early 80s when there was barely any Westerners. In fact, I think for one summer I might have been the only Westerner. And we had lots and lots of time with Thich Nhat Hanh, and I was relishing in translating from the Vietnamese some of the sutras. And one of the wonderful things he was developing at that time was his version of the precepts, which now have become common knowledge, and they're really powerful and a little bit different from the classical Zen and the Buddhist precepts. His first precept, which knocked me off my seat, was do not impose a system of thought on anybody, especially a Buddhist system of thought, especially children. And I couldn't, it really resonated with me, but I thought to myself, this is number one on your list? Why would it be number one? Well, if this attitude grows, then what we end up doing is trying to reform others, to convince them of the rectitude of our ideas, to save their souls. And we know where that leads, doesn't it? Now, I'm not suggesting in any way that you're doing that, dear questioner, but we must learn the serenity prayer to develop the serenity to accept that things we can't in the moment change. That Aboriginal woman I spoke about before, she was answering your question as well. If you've come to help me, quotes, you can turn around and go back. Or I would add, change me or reform me. But if you've come with the understanding that our liberation is bound up with one another, why then come? And I would say, and Thich Nhat Hanh also said, have a dialogue with me, listen to me, inquire with me, respectfully. Now, this is much harder to do with someone who you don't already know to be an extremely loving, loved one of yours. It's much harder. Sometimes I think it might be impossible in some cases, and so we just respectfully turn away. But still holding that other person as a jewel in the net of Indra. So those would be some of my thoughts.
Thank you for that answer. Patricia writes, she says, my loss is so overwhelming. I'm stuck in my life without being able to move. How do I gather momentum to accomplish what I need to do?
What is your loss? Could you send that another part of the question, or if that's not possible, I'll just dive in. in the early 80s in the Maui Zendo, many of us, because our teacher was Robert Aitken, one of the founders of Engaged Buddhism, we were very sensitive to the world at that time. And there was a grave nuclear threat. Robert Aitken was doing self-care and meditation training for protesters against the Trident submarine up in the Pacific Northwest. Children were hiding under their chairs in drills, and there was a terror kind of gripping the land. And many of us felt impotent and sad and didn't know what to do with all of that sadness. So I had heard of someone named, not very well known then at all, this is the very early 80s, Joanna something. Yeah, Joanna Macy. And she was just beginning out of her own despair, right? All the best theories, the best teachings, the best practices people develop because it helps them. And hopefully they hope it will help others too. They practiced it. So Joanna came to Maui and she led a despair and empowerment workshop at that time. And I learned so much. It's just part of me by now. So I can't tell where that stops and where I begin. But the crux of her work, which she finally came to feel about herself, was that she wasn't crazy. And she wasn't all alone. That there were other like-minded people who were feeling this sense of loss and sadness. And she helped us learn together in community that this was a sign that there was a sign of life inside of us. We had a beating heart. If we didn't, we wouldn't be feeling a sense of sadness or loss. And again, I would say that find opportunities for community Dharma practice, and communion with the more than human world. Let yourself take the inflow from the more than human world. Feel connected. Feel breathed by the forest. Let that sense of aliveness rekindle. Now, there may be some issues that are coming up that, it might be helpful to talk to a therapist about. I don't know. But the humanizing that Joanna would do of our pain went so far to dissolve that pain, and the sense of community and sharing it and recasting ourselves as agents of change and pain as the price of our caring for the world and learning how to transform it. It set the stage for my activism as a Buddhist. So those are some thoughts. I hope they're helpful to you.
Thank you. Patricia did write in to describe her situation a little more. She said that her husband has left her with her 3 children.
Well, Patricia, we are all standing on the shoulders of those who came before us. And the only thing I can say is there are a lot of women, and I don't know if you're Black or brown or Asian or Caucasian, but there are particularly a lot of Black and brown women who have developed such big shoulders to raise their children. And my mother is one of them. She's white. I don't know where mothers find it. They must have a separate stash. They have to let us know. Somehow they're able to transform their utter abject kind of sense of loss and hopelessness. Maybe it's because they look their kids in the eyes and they say, They need me. I can't check out on them. I have to dig deep. So I invite you to remember those who came before you. I invite you to make common cause with the mothers of all the Black children who've been murdered and who've been thrown back on their own resources, but know that they have found solidarity, that they have come to know that they're not alone, that they have a village to support them. And I hope you come to feel that. I hope you come to feel that support. Thank you so much for your question.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you, Roshi. So we have time for about one more question. And there are a couple questions coming up about people's experiences of the meditation. So I'll ask Betsy's question. Betsy says, when I inhale images of suffering, I suffer by a tightening of my throat, which is painful. How do I transform this pain?
I would just breathe right into that tightness. If you're imagining that tightness with a temperature, perhaps just reflect and see, does that tightness have a temperature? I would imagine that it does. Imagine, say, that it has a warm temperature. And then visualize your breath as a ribbon of cool air. And in your mind's eye, you're breathing directly into that tightness, into that pain in your throat, and allowing it to begin to unpack, allowing it to form little granules or smaller pieces, not to be so packed in. We think of ourselves as isolated, and so sometimes the states that we encounter feel like they're hopeless. But actually, we are resilient patterns, softly assembled. If we can find skillful ways to dissolve what feels like an endless sort of stuck state, it's a little awakening. I tell you, it is a little awakening. How did that happen? Well, we've gone back to our true nature. Our true nature is an impermanent nature. But when things get stuck, they can't change, they can't flow, they can't transform. So I would try using your breath as a cool stream of air. Just as we were breathing the pain into our heart, some people's hearts get tight. I know occasionally a precursor to a traumatic memory may be clenched muscles around the heart. It sort of feels like it's breaking, but actually we're much more supple than that. So I would practice this breath stream practice and allow your mind to incline, at least in the direction that deconstructing that stuckness is possible. And if you have faith that it's possible, and you do this practice, and you let yourself relax into it, maybe it will start to transform. I think it might well. Well, good luck. Were there other questions about the meditation?
There were a few others. If you'd like to keep going,
Sure.
I could pick out some more. And just recognizing that it's 2, so for anyone who does have to leave, we really want to thank you for joining us. And we hope you have a great rest of your day. So let me just review this question.
Oh, shall we maybe just take one more then, Eliza, about the meditation? Okay.
So an anonymous attendee says, I feel numbness. how do I, quote, get in touch with my feelings?
I'm assuming, and I could be wrong, that the numbness you feel is related to the current turbulence, upheaval, uprising, violence in the world. I'm going to assume that. I'm sounding like a broken record today. And I've got to say the same thing as starters. The same thing happens about grief. People will lose somebody or lose something terrible, and then they'll feel like, people say I should be feeling grief. I should be going through the stages. Why aren't I doing that? And before you know it, they're on their own cases, and they've got more than grief. They've got a judgment problem. They've got all kinds of problems. So numbing out is one very human, understandable reaction that's in our psychological toolkit. We've learned as mammals that when things get just completely overwhelming and we're not able to use fight and flight, if we're just immobilized, there's another defense. It's come to be known as a freeze, but it's a kind of shutdown. And in its extreme form, very extreme form, we can actually die from that. Reptiles do very well with that. They use that to disguise themselves, but mammals don't do well with that extreme shutdown. And it's only utilized when there's nothing else that works. But at the other end of the continuum, it manifests as a kind of numbness. So the first thing is to recognize that you're not crazy. And you're not condemned to numbness for the rest of your life. That it's a state, not necessarily an inculcated, unchanging trait of yours. And just knowing that there are others like you and being able to share it is the first step. Now, there must be a sense of fright underneath this numbness. Perhaps even a sense of scared to deafness or terror. And I remember what my old teacher said in the early 80s. He said, take your little child, or you could say, take your numbness and hold it close to your breast and tell it, it's okay. You understand. There's somebody, you, who understands this numbness, that there must be all kinds of terror. And you understand that in good time, with your support and with the support of being in touch with the more than human world, and in solidarity with others, sitting, standing with them, that you know that over time this will begin to ebb. So you tell this incredibly vulnerable but numb part of you that it won't always be this way. That they can let in a sense of life little by little, and that there will be joy one day, and there will also be pain one day, but that they will find the resiliency to let themselves come back to life. So maybe we'll stop here and do another couple of minutes of meditation before we close.
Sure, we'll do a minute of meditation.
Minute of meditation.
I'll wrap it up. Thank you, Roshi.
Let's let ourselves appreciate the solidarity that we've shared this morning, partners in resistance, reclaiming our own liveliness, partners in resilience, finding a suppleness that we didn't even know was there, and partners in healing and awakening to the joys, the tender mercies that this life holds for us, as well as its pain and suffering. We open to that. We appreciate the blessings of our company. And we take the fruits of our meditation with us and share them widely with everyone we come to meet. I'm very grateful to be able to have been with all of you today, and I wish you all well.